What if the way you vote could be eliminated with the stroke of a pen? Right now, civil rights groups are battling in federal court over a presidential executive order that targets mail-in voting across America. The stakes could not be higher. This case will determine whether the executive branch can override state election laws and potentially disenfranchise millions of voters. Welcome to Court Decoded. Today we cover the explosive constitutional battle over mail-in voting, where civil rights organizations are challenging presidential power in a case that could reshape American elections forever. The Trump administration issued an executive order aimed at restricting mail-in voting across the United States. The order seeks to impose new federal limitations on how states can conduct elections by mail, targeting a voting method used by tens of millions of Americans. The administration argues this action is necessary to ensure election integrity and prevent potential fraud. However, critics immediately condemned the order as an unconstitutional overreach of executive power. The order attempts to establish federal standards that would override existing state laws governing mail-in ballots. This sets up a direct conflict between presidential authority and the traditional power of states to administer their own elections. Within days of the order being signed, multiple civil rights organizations announced they would challenge it in federal court, setting the stage for one of the most significant voting rights cases in modern American history. A coalition of civil rights organizations moved swiftly to challenge the executive order in federal court. These groups argue that the order represents a fundamental violation of constitutional principles and threatens to strip voting access from vulnerable populations. The plaintiffs include organizations with decades of experience fighting for voting rights, and they have assembled formidable legal teams for this battle. Their complaint alleges that the executive order violates multiple constitutional provisions and federal statutes designed to protect the right to vote. The lawsuit seeks an immediate injunction to block implementation of the order while the case proceeds through the courts. The civil rights groups argue that allowing the order to take effect would cause irreparable harm to voters who depend on mail-in ballots, including elderly citizens, people with disabilities, military personnel stationed overseas, and workers who cannot take time off to vote in person. At the heart of this case lies a fundamental question about the Constitution's election clause. Article 1, Section 4, grants state legislatures the primary authority to determine the time, place, and manner of elections. The civil rights plaintiffs argue this means the president cannot unilaterally impose restrictions on how states conduct their elections through executive order. The administration counters that the president has broad authority to ensure election integrity under various federal statutes and constitutional provisions. The plaintiffs also invoke the 14th and 15th Amendments, which prohibit states from denying citizens the right to vote and guarantee equal protection under the law. They argue that restricting mail-in voting disproportionately burdens certain groups of voters, creating an unconstitutional barrier to the ballot box. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 provides additional ammunition for the plaintiffs, as it prohibits practices that result in the denial or abridgment of voting rights. Mail-in voting has deep roots in American history, stretching back to the Civil War when Union soldiers cast absentee ballots from battlefields. Since then, every state has developed some form of voting by mail, recognizing its importance for citizens who cannot physically reach polling places. 5 states currently conduct all elections primarily by mail, while others offer various absentee voting options. The COVID-19 pandemic dramatically accelerated the adoption of mail voting, with a record number of Americans casting ballots by mail in the 2020 election. Studies have consistently shown that mail-in voting is secure, with fraud rates that are statistically negligible. Election officials from both parties have defended the integrity of mail voting systems, pointing to multiple safeguards, including signature verification, ballot tracking, and secure drop boxes. The executive order challenges this established system, potentially affecting the 46 million Americans who voted by mail in the most recent presidential election. This lawsuit reopens a centuries-old debate about federalism and the balance of power between state and federal governments. The Constitution deliberately gave states primary control over election administration, reflecting the founders' belief in decentralized governance. Several state attorneys general have already announced they will join the lawsuit or file separate challenges, arguing the executive order infringes on their sovereign authority to conduct elections. The administration maintains that federal oversight is necessary and constitutional, citing the need for uniform standards across states. Legal scholars are divided on the merits of both arguments, though many note that courts have historically been skeptical of federal attempts to override state election procedures without explicit congressional authorization. The case could ultimately require the Supreme Court to clarify the boundaries of executive power in election administration, a question with enormous implications for future presidents of either party. The potential consequences of restricting mail-in voting would fall heavily on specific populations. Elderly voters, who often face mobility challenges and health concerns, have long relied on mail ballots to exercise their constitutional rights. Voters with disabilities may find it physically impossible to wait in long lines or access traditional polling places. Military personnel and their families stationed overseas depend entirely on mail voting to participate in democracy while serving their country. Rural voters in sprawling western states may live hours from the nearest polling location. Working Americans in hourly jobs often cannot afford to take time off to vote in person. Civil rights groups argue that any restriction on mail voting would effectively create a two-tiered system where some citizens face significant barriers to casting their ballots while others do not. Federal courts will examine this case against a backdrop of crucial legal precedents. The Supreme Court has long held that the right to vote is fundamental and that any restrictions must be carefully scrutinized. In landmark cases dating back decades, courts have struck down barriers to voting that disproportionately affect certain groups of citizens. The plaintiffs will likely cite the Supreme Court's ruling in Harper v. Virginia, which held that wealth cannot determine access to the ballot. They may also invoke the Anderson-Burdick test, which weighs the burden placed on voters against the government's stated interests. The administration will need to demonstrate that any restrictions serve a compelling governmental interest and are narrowly tailored to achieve that goal. Legal experts suggest the government will face an uphill battle, proving that sweeping mail-in voting restrictions meet this high constitutional standard, particularly given the lack of evidence of widespread fraud in mail voting. The federal court must now decide whether to issue a preliminary injunction blocking the executive order while the case proceeds. This initial ruling could come within weeks and will set the tone for the entire litigation. If the court blocks the order, the administration will almost certainly appeal, potentially sending the case to a circuit court of appeals and ultimately to the Supreme Court. The timeline is critical because any restrictions on mail voting could affect upcoming elections if implemented quickly. Both sides are preparing for an extended legal battle that could take months or even years to fully resolve. Meanwhile, state election officials face uncertainty about how to prepare for future elections. The outcome of this case will establish important precedents about executive power over elections that will bind future administrations regardless of party. This case remains in its early stages, but its implications are already profound. The courts must now wrestle with fundamental questions about the limits of executive power and the sanctity of voting rights. Whatever the outcome, this legal battle will shape how Americans cast their ballots for generations. The Constitution established a delicate balance between federal authority and state sovereignty in elections. This case will test whether that balance can withstand attempts to centralize control over voting methods. The legal lesson here is clear. The right to vote is not absolute and requires constant vigilance to protect. Executive orders may seem powerful, but they must still answer to the Constitution. The outcome will remind Americans that their voting rights are worth fighting for in court. If you found this constitutional battle fascinating, hit subscribe and ring the notification bell. New legal breakdowns drop every week. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what is at stake for American democracy.